In the early hours of October 4th, 2002, a young 17-year-old trans woman, Gwen Araujo, was murdered at the hands of 4 men after being tortured. She was beaten, strangled, tied up, and hit with a shovel. They would drive over 2 hours to dispose of her, where they believed that no one would find her body, and celebrated with McDonald's breakfast as they drove home to the Bay Area. But the reasons that Gwen was murdered were rife with transphobia, homophobia, and sexism. In this episode, we unpack the details of the murder of Gwen Araujo. Welcome to part 3 of the murder of Gwen Araujo on California True Crime. I'm Charles. I'll be leading you through part 3 of this story as I have the first 2 parts. If you haven't listened to part 1 or part 2, I recommend you stop here, go download those episodes, listen to them, and come back. If you have joined us for the first 2, we're glad that you decided to stick with us and listen to it. We know that the last episode was very brutal. We do warn you that some of the stuff that we will talking about may be triggers for some of you. So if that's an issue, you might want to skip this episode. But we hope that you stick with us and listen to it. Last episode, we did spend a lot of time talking about the last couple of days of Gwen's life and the brutality that she suffered, not just physically, but also the mental torture that she suffered at the hands of her killers. Before we continue with this episode, which is going to really deal with the aftermath of her death in the days after her body was dropped in the woods, leading up to the arrest of her killers and into the first trial. I want to welcome, as always, Jessica and Sean with me, who've been with me in the last 2 episodes, and we're going to get through the next 3 episodes. This will be a 5-part series, as we mentioned. How are you guys this evening?
Good.
I'm doing good.
Do you guys want to share anything so far, your feelings about this case up to this point before we continue?
I think you kind of hit it there with the last episode. Everything you shared with us about the last day, with Gwen's murder and what she went through and how just horrible that it was. And also, I think the callousness, because you had such important details of the murderers, was really striking, and I can't stop thinking about that.
Yeah, for me, I feel like the descriptions used in the house the night of the murder, how it played out, it's almost like you can't put down a good book. That's a horrible description, but at the same time, everything is so right there and you can picture everything. You can make it in your head just like when you're reading a book about something. And it was really painful and hard to listen to just because it's so descriptive and you know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, for me, I think that I agree. I think the vividness of the descriptions, and those were taken from both court records, some wonderful reporting that were done by local reporters in the Bay Area when they were covering this case initially, and some stuff that was said by family and friends of Gwen after the fact. It's really stuck with me since we've started working on this case. I think something that we have to constantly remember is that this is another example of these kind of details being read out in court. And in some cases, a lot more graphic detail than what we went over here. And her family is there having to relive these last few agonizing hours of their daughter in front of the people that killed her. And it is one, I agree, this is one that has really bothered me, I think, more than some of the other things that we've researched, or I know some of the other things that I've looked up. I also think that it is because of the vividness of, and almost the matter-of-factness that her killers will talk about ending her life. And in such a way, it has, it's really stuck with me. And we've been working on this for a while. As with all of our episodes in this series, my information will be cited on our website, californiatruecrime.com. If you haven't visited our website, please do so. You can find our blog, which is updated every few weeks with some new stories, some bonus content from the episodes that we didn't cover, other stories of related cases, or just our process of how we're working through it. But this will be on the Gwen Araujo page, which is in our episodes page. The majority of the information being taken from local newspapers of the time, like the Mercury News, as well as the East Bay Times. Like I said, please don't forget to stop by our website for more information and a complete works cited page, as well as all of the other sources that we've used for not only this episode, but every episode on californiatruecrime.com. And with that, we're going to get back into really picking it up right the next day. So remember, as I said at the opening, the four men drove home and stopped for McDonald's breakfast after murdering and discarding Gwen's body in the woods with a promise to never talk to anyone about the murder that they had committed. And this would be a promise that one of them would break almost immediately and would directly lead to the four men being arrested and charged with Gwen's murder. Silvia Guerrero, Gwen's mother, would report her daughter missing the next day after the party. She would say that she had a mother's intuition that something horrible had gone wrong and that she knew that her daughter was dead. This was taken from a quote of hers from season 1, episode 4 of Murder Among Friends. October 3rd was the last time any of her family or friends had seen her. She was killed on Friday the 4th. Her mother would report her missing on October 5th. It would be reported in the LA Times that Gwen's aunt, Imelda Guerrero, would call the police on October 9th about hearing rumors of someone killing a man dressed as a woman at some party held in the area. So this is 4 days after her mom reported her missing. A rumor was already starting to circulate in the area that a group of people or somebody killed somebody else at a party in the area, and it had involved a man dressed as a woman, which, again, the only reason why we're bringing this up is because that is the way it was reported to, or that's the rumor that was circulating around the area. That was the rumor that Gwen's aunt heard. There's no mention of when or how the police followed up on this tip, but it wouldn't be until October 15th, 11 days after Gwen had been killed, that her body would be found, 30 miles east of Placerville at the El Dorado Hills campground near Silver Fork Road.
Was there any information that you saw about how the police received the information that there was someone missing, whether they responded to it or?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a second, of how that rumor gets started and how it circulates and eventually how it will get to Gwen's aunt. As far as how it goes from there, and then what the next steps of the police, will go into the exact procedure. We don't have a lot of information on how it was handled when Gwen's mom, Silvia, reported her missing. There's not a lot reported of whether they took it seriously, whether they kind of, I won't say blow it off, but something of that nature. So hold with me, and we're gonna get to the kind of the intricacies of that. The tip that led police finding the body almost 3 hours away from where she was killed had come from somebody named Andrew. The person called and let the police know that there was a rumor floating around a local college campus of a murder that happened where the killers dumped the body in the Sierra Nevadas, not far away from Lake Tahoe. This would eventually lead the police to Gwen's body, but not directly. The rumors were already being spread through the social network of gossip on the Monday after the killing. So now remember, we're talking, 2002. So this is pre-Instagram, pre-Twitter. It's in the last vestiges of MySpace. And I think, Facebook's not even really a thing yet at this point.
Friendster was still around then.
Friendster's still around. And it is a college campus. So the feeling I got in the reports where this is really old school gossip, like a friend told a friend told a friend, kind of thing. And this gossip really seems to kind of point in one direction, and that being Jaron Neighbors. And it seems that Jaron Neighbors would spill his secrets to his friend Adam Hewson, who was 21 years old. If you remember correctly, Jaron Neighbors was 19. And so Jaron had a kind of a habit of hanging out with people a little older than him. Again, this college. So they were actually getting together to watch the Packers-Bears game on Monday Night Football. I actually did not look up who won that game, Sean, but I did want to bring up that it was reported that was the game that they were watching when the story kind of takes place. Now, Neighbors would tell Adam that he had been there when his friends had disposed of a body. Adam was there with two of roommates, Brian Seabrand, 25, and Brian Covert, 28. All agreed that the story was somewhat hard to believe. After all, people say a lot of things, especially when they've been drinking or using drugs, and they did not really believe Jaron, but they would pass the rumor on just the same. Seabrand would eventually tell a friend of his, Robert Seamow, who was 26, who was actually related by marriage to a cousin of David Guerrero's, who is Gwen's uncle, and his wife, Gwen's aunt, would eventually call the police. So before we go further, because that was a weird knot of happenstance. So Jaron Neighbors is hanging out on Monday Night Football with his other friend, Andrew, and they're watching this game with Andrew's two roommates. And casually, while they're watching football and eating, and it sounds like they're drinking. I don't know about the drugs part. That was kind of thrown in as an editorializing by one of the newspaper reporters, but it was pretty clear that they had been drinking. Jaron says, "Oh, by the way," or to that effect, "over the weekend, I was hanging out with these other guys when they had killed somebody and disposed of a body." And the three roommates don't pay him a lot of mind because, from what I understand, they had the same feeling about Jaron that a lot of people did, that he was kind of full of hot air. So then Seabrand, he's going to tell a friend of his, remember what I said this, Robert Seamow, and he's related to David Guerrero, who is Gwen's aunt's husband. So he's related to Gwen's uncle.
I find it so crazy that it comes back like this. We're in the Bay Area. It's a big place.
Right.
We talked about this in the Carlo Mercado case. They did phone pinging for a whole year back, and they couldn't find that these people were ever even in the same area for a whole year together. And then these people, it's just a little chain of a rumor that gets all the way back to a family member.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that sometimes people outside of San Francisco, the Bay Area, and really outside of California, sometimes don't really realize, is that there's a lot of California that looks big but still functions as small towns. And I really get the feeling like Newark is one of those places that it's really close to the Bay Area, the bigger Bay Area. It has a lot of Bay Area vibes. There's a lot of people there, but it still has this small town feeling, this kind of gossip network, on top of which all these guys are college students or living close to college campus. And if you've ever been to a college campus or was a college student yourself, you know that kind of stuff, it is really like a gossip circle where that stuff will spread. People talk. It's no different than when you're in high school or grammar school, really. Now, it's, again, like I said, it's Gwen's aunt is the one that initially calls the police and says, "Hey, listen, my sister reported our niece missing. I'm now hearing rumors that somebody was murdered over the weekend. You guys need to look into this." And this is going to lead police back all the way back to Adam. Okay. Now, there was a report that Adam would eventually call the police himself, but it was only after Guerrero called. So the way I kind of get this is this is going to confirm the story that Gwen's aunt was reported that the murder was supposedly taking place could be in fact linked to Gwen's disappearance. So I guess it's all kind of happens at the same time or a little bit. So the rumor gets started mainly because Jaron is kind of shooting his mouth off. He goes and hangs out at this party, and not party. It's four guys watching football. These guys start spreading the rumor. It gets back to Gwen's aunt. Gwen's aunt calls the police, and in the meantime, Adam has kind of had a change of heart and says, maybe I should call the police. And so he ends up calling the police as well. Now, the police would follow up with Adam to get the story straight from him. He would tell him of his conversation with neighbors. In fact, they would even convince him to wear a wire and talk to neighbors again in an effort to incriminate him, being Jaron. Now, this conversation between Adam and neighbors, this recorded conversation, this in turn would give them enough evidence to go pick up neighbors on suspicion of murder and interrogate him just to find out what he knows. So, and this is from newspaper articles and court testimony. I don't believe at this point the police are really saying, we're not 100% sure. There's a rumor, there's a kid shooting his mouth off, and we have a report. We're going to go follow up on it.
But, that's a pretty big deal. We have other cases where that wouldn't have been enough, I don't think. And they're like, let's try and figure this out.
Absolutely. I want to say, I don't think that the police were saying that this is a person of interest. They're not jumping to a conclusion, but this is right now, this is what we have to go on, and that's what we're going to go with. And it turns out he knew a lot and became the key witness for the prosecution. So and we know from the previous episode, Jaron Neighbors' involvement in all this. Now, before that, though, Gwen's body has to be found and an autopsy has to be performed. So remember, this is when we talked about between her going missing on the 4th, her being murdered on the 4th, her reported on the 5th, and her found on the 15th. This is what's going on in that interim time. So this is like you said, Jessica, we've had other cases where we didn't have that much to go on right away. Within a couple of days, they have a credible rumor, they have a credible source, they press that source, they find the actual person that they want, a person of interest, and they get a recorded conversation that they can then go arrest the person for. Now, after being interrogated and confronted with the tape of him and Adam talking about the whole story, everything starts to spill out. Jaron Neighbors will eventually lead the police to the place where 11 days before they had thrown the body of Gwen Araujo into a shabby makeshift grave. Even though the police recover the body quickly, they ran into issues. Gwen's body had been laying in the open for 10 days. Her body had been decomposed and had been left to the predation of nature to the point where they were not able to get a positive ID or really a clear idea of the cause of death. One thing was clear. There was a lot of blood, especially around the scalp. She was wrapped in a blue blanket with a rope around her neck and heavy damage to her head and face. The police would transfer her body to the medical examiner, but for some reason the autopsy would be delayed for the next 24 hours. Once Gwen's body is found, the detectives begin to piece the events that transpired together, and the picture that they see is what we covered in our last episode. And again, that comes directly from court records from the testimony of all 4 murderers and police detectives based on forensic evidence. They will move to arrest Paul Morrell, his brother Jose, Michael Magson, and Jaron Neighbors, who they already have in custody. This would be October 17th, 2 days after Gwen's body was found and 13 days after she was killed. They would also bring in Nicole Brown, Paul's girlfriend, as well as his younger brother, Emmanuel. It would soon be determined that Paul, Nicole, and Emmanuel were not there at the time of the killing, so they would be let go and would not be charged in any way with Gwen's death, though Paul would be held on a parole violation. It would be Michael Magson, Jose Morrell, and Jaron Neighbors who would face the murder charges with a hate crime addition. On October 24th, Jaron Neighbors pleaded not guilty. His attorney, Robert Beals, would say, quote, "As far as my client is concerned, the plea is not guilty to the charge of murder, adamantly denies the allegations of a hate crime," unquote. Jose Morrell's public defender would delay his arraignment due to needing more time to look at the evidence against him. Morrell would be interviewed by the LA Times and say that he was innocent. He would state, quote, "All I know is that I'm innocent and I shouldn't even be here right now. I should be at home with my family," unquote. Magson, on the other hand, would not stop talking. He also gave an interview to the LA Times. He had put off entering a plea because he was still looking for a lawyer. It didn't go into a lot of detail about why he couldn't find a lawyer, but they clearly state that there was delays due to this. He even states in an interview that he had been advised by his family not to talk to anyone, especially the media, but he continues to state that he, quote, "would love to talk about this, but I can't." He continues, quote, "I can't even say," when he was asked about whether or not he was innocent. So I don't know. I find that interesting that he is advised. It seems like everybody's since telling him, just be quiet, you're arrested, that whole Fifth Amendment thing, and he's just not paying attention to it.
Yeah, some people just like to talk. From every episode, I think, we learned, do not talk. And
right.
Some people still just love to talk.
I mean, how many times I know we've talked about that with the Dateline shows and the 48-hour shows when you see those people arrested, and a lot of them, not that these people are, but when we see those shows with those people being arrested that are innocent of their crime, and they think that if I'm talking to police, then the police are going to know I'm innocent. No, make sure you have a lawyer. Mm-hmm. But I do want to go on something that we mentioned a couple of times here before we go on anything else. specifically about the hate crime addition to charges. Sean, I think you have some information to share with us about that.
Yeah, so while trying to get the history of how hate crimes and these added charges came about, it was kind of hard. You would maybe kind of think that this should have always been there, but in hindsight, things, I guess, were different. So it felt like this was kind of a snowball effect where things get added to laws as more terrible things happened. It all kind of started with the Civil Rights Act of 1968 and went from there. I'm not saying everything is attached to that act or that act is just amended a million times. It just seems to be the spark on how the laws started. There are other major stepping stones that came in, like the Ralph Act and the Bain Act. Then you had the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 94 and the Church Arson Prevention Act of 1966, but in California. These all seem to be dealing with civil rights all based on race. And California was making steps for the LGBTQIA plus community, such as in 1984, the start of outlawing employment discrimination based on sexual orientation was brought up, but it took many years before it was inked into law. But it seems to take major steps for the subject of hate crime starting around 1999. I found a site called OC Human Relations that kind of takes you on a timeline of how laws have changed through the years. And we see this with AB 208 that says, quote, requires that a person who commits first-degree murder be punished by life imprisonment without the possibility of parole if the victim was intentionally killed because of the victim's actual or perceived disability, gender, or sexual orientation. One thing I found interesting is the wording they have to put in on some of these things, and this was one of them. It says, for example, if heterosexual person is targeted because she or he is mistaken for being gay by the perpetrator, the additional penalty would still apply. It's just the weird wording to me. I don't know if it was weird to you, how you heard that.
So they're saying that if someone is attacked, for instance, because they're believed to be gay, but it turns out they're not, you can still apply the hate crime addition to it? Okay.
Yes.
That makes sense, I think.
Mm-hmm. But I think, like you said, John, sometimes when you read some of these statutes and these laws, it does take a third or fourth or sometimes 12th reading to really suss out exactly.
Right, and just the wording is like laws. The wording has to be so specific, which we've learned that loopholes will happen if it's not. But it's just It's interesting to me. I'm not going to go over all of them because there seems to just be a new law introduced or a revision of a law every year for the last 10 years. Not all would go through or pass, though. Now, at the time of Gwen's murder, we were years away from the Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which was written after what happened to Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr., but it didn't actually get passed until 2009. Now, as of today, pretty much every state has their own hate laws enhancement in play, except Arkansas, South Carolina, and Wyoming. I watched a news report and I saw Arkansas is working on it, and I'm not saying the others aren't, I just didn't see it. Even though some states have hate crime laws, some states aren't still fully covering humans. For example, Alabama, current law covers race, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, or physical or mental disability. There's a proposed law to add sexual orientation, but not of yet.
So they are really covering everything except for, like you just said, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression.
Right. It's everything else, but they just seem to keep leaving this out.
Thank you. And I think the thing that we're going to find as we go through this case and others, when we bring up this hate crime addition, what struck me really is proving that's the reason why you killed somebody, or that person killed somebody else, or that person was assaulted because of a hate crime. And I think there's that line that looking at the crime and hearing the evidence, that person was killed because of a hate crime. But as oftentimes, if you've listened to our show, you know that that's is what you can, and it's that adage you see in all courtroom TV shows. What you can prove in a court is different than what you may believe happened, or even sometimes in cases of what the truth is. And this really would just become the beginning of what will become a very highly publicized trial that unfortunately splashes Gwen's life all over the front pages of not just local or California newspapers, but really all over the nation. This would lead to Gwen's death becoming a rallying cry for those in the trans community to call for justice, as well as bringing attention to the plight of trans men and women who are being victimized and killed, not just in California, but really all over the United States, and in fact, the entire world. Though for one family, it would mean that the public at large would become intimately involved with the horrible last hours of their loved one's life. Gwen's family would hold 2 separate services, both on Friday, October 24th. The first was a small family and close friends service, followed by a larger one that was open to the public, held that afternoon. The public service attracted over 700 people. Gwen's family would welcome any that were there to express their regret at Gwen's passing, but warned that any person that was there to spread hate would not be welcome. This was a direct reference to the anti-gay preacher Fred Phelps, who was the pastor of the Westboro Baptist Church centered in Topeka, Kansas. Phelps is dead now, but I imagine most of you that are listening to this may be familiar with him. He is the leader of this particular church, which is unfortunately still in existence, that protests soldiers' funerals, police officers' funerals, funerals of LGBTQIA plus people, and expresses their hatred towards really anybody that believes anything other than what they preach. If you remember that this was also the group in the 90s that would protest Matthew Shepard's funeral, they also claimed that 9/11 was a punishment set by the Christian God, and they had threatened to appear at Gwen's service, but did not actually show. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, this group is still around, though since the death of their founder and leader, they have a very small, or I would say a smaller media presence. At the service, the assembled crowd would file past an open casket where Gwen was laying dressed as she had lived as a young woman. Gwen's family would speak to the crowd about the kind of person that she was. Father Jeffrey Finley would say, quote, "I believe that our lives are changed now. I want to believe that we will be able to say to each other, I appreciate who you are," unquote. When the services were done, the family would release 17 butterflies, one for each of Gwen's 17 years of life. And I know I shared some information with you guys about the service, and I know you guys did your own reading on some of those articles. Did you have any thoughts about that? For me, it was like I have a hard time really just even going back over it. It was, I think it's the other thing. We haven't really covered a lot of the services for those people that have passed in some of the cases that we went over. And I think this is the first time I really looked into a funeral of one of our victims.
I found when I was doing research on this, I found the program from the funeral, and I thought it was interesting because you just mentioned how Gwen was in a dress, and a lot of people used the dead name of Edward. It was in the program. I know it's a different time, even though it doesn't feel that long ago, but it's just really interesting. I found that kind of it just kind of took me back, how it's still in the 2000s and they weren't really figuring that part out.
No, and I know in one respect it's not that long ago, but then when you think about it, it is, it's almost 18 years ago. And Silvia would talk about that. Her mother later will talk about the idea that at the time, eventually, and we will go over this again, so I'm just going to mention it in passing now, that Silvia will change Gwen's name legally to Gwen Araujo. But she speaks that they were still struggling with that at that time. And I think it had not been that many years since she had come out to her family. So I think they're still processing a lot of everything going on. It's a hard thing to deal with, I would imagine, for anyone, and then to lose your child and then still struggling with coming to terms with the person that your child is and not have that child around anymore. So yeah, I understand. What I have a harder time swallowing is and we will, well, like I said, we'll go over this more as we go along, but is the newspapers doing it,
Right.
and the news media covering it and using her dead name.
I wasn't trying to say that what they were doing was
No.
wrong or anything.
I
I
100% understand.
Yeah, I found it. I think it's just because where we are now, and I lived through this time. It's interesting to me that it was like that.
Well, and I think I struggled that. For me, I know reading this and looking at it and thinking back and saying, how would I have talked about her in the early 2000s after she had died? Would I have known not to use a person's dead name? I don't think I would have.
Yeah, or he instead of she. Yeah, it's
right,
hard.
and using the correct pronouns.
Yeah, we can make ourselves sound like we would be perfect people back then, but yeah, who knows? We didn't. I mean, myself, I didn't deal with it that much. Any types of changes around me like that, where I had to learn at that time. So
right.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And I even, you know, on a personal note, that's not even writing this. I mean, I won't say it was a struggle. It was a welcome struggle. I enjoyed learning about her life and then trying to do some service to the story. But I struggled with how appropriately to write about her. And so what I will suggest is if you're listening to this and we have resources on our website, one of them is a link to an article from the GLAAD website about how people that write about the transgender community, how they should write news articles, how journalists should tackle these kinds of issues. And I'd suggest if you're interested, anybody should take it even as a novice as myself. I learned a lot from it, and it kind of helped put some things in order for me when writing about subjects like this.
And I'd like to think that this wouldn't happen now, but a lot of the statistics that I looked up that I shared, I think for the first episode,
right,
seem to indicate that in a lot of places, even here in California, where people think, oh, this couldn't happen because it's California or the Bay Area, that it would be pretty common for people to use your dead name or the wrong pronoun or to hurt you or attack you. And I don't know, it's just it's frustrating.
No, I understand what you're saying. I think in kind of on the tail end of what Sean was saying as well, we like sometimes to think that we are more aware than we really are. But I agree with you, Jessica. I think we have more instances of this going on. It's not completely stamped out.
Well, and just looking at the cold cases you're using for these episodes, They were still written with the wrong pronouns. And, you know, we worked to try and figure out what that person would have wanted and how to address that.
More than one of the cold cases actually specifically was not listed as a cold case because they did not identify the victim. His own friends and family didn't know that they were deceased because they hadn't been reported because they misgendered the person. And so again, we may like to think that we know more than we do or act better. And by we, I don't mean necessarily the three of us. Not that we're any paragons of virtue in that respect, but I think we're all struggling with this. But I think the key is, and what I really respected from Gwen's family is a willingness and an openness, because Silvia Guerrero, we'll talk about this later, is that she was learning right along with everyone else. She came to terms with it and then made that change and said, yes, we're going to honor Gwen the way she lived. And then, you know, Gwen's name is on her tombstone, her legal name. And as we go in, I do want you guys to pay attention to that as we go into the first court case and the second court case, because it will, unfortunately, some of that will carry over to that as well.
But it is amazing that there were so many people at the funeral. And then I think we saw some candlelight vigils. Mm-hmm. People were dressed as, there were a lot of people who came to those and with the candles, and some people dressed as angels.
Yeah, it was really neat. It was a group, and I don't remember. I don't think they were specifically started for this, but it was a group of volunteers that said when the Westboro Baptist Church had made really public that they were going to come and they were going to protest this funeral, this group of supporters dressed in all white, and you may have seen them on sometimes in certain funerals, and they basically put their arms up and they shield the family from. Well, any of the hatred or the vitriol that's spouted, and it's really impressive. So not only was the family dealing with the death of their loved one, but this case was quickly spreading through the media and bringing a lot of attention on Gwen's death. But it also brought a lot of attention to the plight of the trans community. Again, not just in California, but all over the United States. A community that had struggled with getting attention for those people that had been victims of violence in the past. Remember that this crime happened in 2002. Even at that, the trans community was not widely accepted, even by other organizations and help centers that would help or support those in the gay community. San Francisco, to those that are not from there or are not familiar with the history of the area, look at it as a place of acceptance to everyone. Like San Francisco, it's the Bay Area. Everybody's welcome, everybody's happy, and everybody's, neighbors are friendly and things like that. And that's not the case. San Francisco and the Bay Area, not that there aren't pockets of that, but it's like anywhere else. It has a complex history of dealing with struggle and strife and hatred and bigotry. And those places that are within the city have carved out a center of acceptance. But that has not come easily or quickly. It's been a constant battle and one that is continuing even now. It's true that it's better than it was, but there's many places in the Bay Area where this enlightened and progressive attitude has not reached or is still being slow to being adopted. Gwen's death was again one that was making headlines because of the nature of the crime, and some of the headlines will call her a cross-dresser or identify her as a man dressed as a woman, and spell out some of the lurid sexual details of the crime. And again, I can't imagine what it would be like to be one of Gwen's family or friends and seeing not only her dead named in the newspapers, but also every terrible thing or what somebody would think of as terrible thing that she did is in the front page. And this question of, and it's almost unspoken, but it's this question of, well, did she have it coming? It's not really murder. I mean, these kids were, these guys, boys just being boys kind of stuff. And a few of the articles, ones that I did not use, I did read and looked at them for context. You start reading into them and you're realizing they're reprinting other articles. They're not really doing the legwork and they're not doing the research that some of the other local or more local newspapers are doing. What do you guys see as the responsibility of a journalist or a reporter when dealing with details like what we've had in the last episode versus a larger context and putting those details in a larger narrative?
It seems kind of clear from the details you shared with us that they're really sensationalizing her life to sell newspapers or magazines or whatever it is, because you could do this really for anybody's who's been a victim in any of our stories, or if one of us died, you could do the same thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all have perhaps some lurid sexual details we wouldn't want people to know, some private life that doesn't really have anything to do with the crime that's happened, but it might get people interested. Mm-hmm. And you're treating her, I think, a lot differently than you would other victims that we've talked about this season or last season. But I do think it's important for us to talk about it because it has an effect, I think, on the outcome of the trial and on what people think of that.
Yeah, I think the problem that I have with it is that those kind of acts happen in a lot of these murders. Let's say sex workers or things like that. And those don't even make it into the paper. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, they have to put in every single detail. So they're using detail with no context. When a sex worker is killed, you don't get detail or any context because they don't even report it. So I think they are, like Jessica's saying, it's just pure sensationalizing it and trying to sell papers, or the news doing the same thing on, selling commercials on their TV networks.
And what also struck me too, and looking at this one and then realizing I went back after doing my initial research when I was collecting a few more sources and kind of cross-checking a few things. I went back and looked at some of my old resources from some of my other cases that we did, and then kind of dipped into even a few of your guys's. And what I realized is a lot of the sources that I took originally were reprints of like AP stories. And Associated Press, I always, those are like my go-to because they're factual, but they're detail-oriented. They're not contextual. And I think the closer you can get to the source, and that's why I really liked what some of the Bay Area reporters were doing, because they were on the ground. They talked to the parents, they talked to the suspects, they talked to they kind of did the legwork to put it in a larger context so that you got a little bit clearer picture. And I think that's a hard one when so many, the same thing gets perpetrated in 2021, is I see a story online and I retweet it. Sometimes I retweet it without reading the entire article, and so I'm shuffling something off. I'm not reading it, digesting it, looking for the content. I'm spitting it back out again. And I think that this is just another indication of that for me.
So these articles in the newspapers or magazines or wherever that you're seeing them in your research are what we would kind of consider as clickbait.
Yeah, I felt so. I think, and I if you're listening to this, and then chances are you listened or read a lot of true crime, and I think that we all have examples of those. And the more we research, it's no different than I look back at the research I did for Little Pete Ching and the box scores that the San Francisco Call used to publish for the Tong Wars. It was people wanted to know who had died the night before. I mean, those were people, but they're willing to put it in the newspaper because they think it'll sell newspapers and it's an entertaining story, to somebody else.
And back then, if you look at old papers, you would see death. Front page, you would see death. And that was crazy. Like, you don't get that anymore.
Well, I'd argue that though, Sean. I mean, if you go, you look back even to some of the pictures from, the Black Dahlia case in LA, her picture was spread all over the paper. In some cases, those photographs are gruesome. Right. We've seen images of that, came out of the Vietnam War, what was coming out and what was put up on the news. I think now what people see has gotten sanitized a little bit on, I'll agree with you a little bit on the evening news. However, I think that may be due to the fact that they're driving people to their online platforms, because I may not want to show you the picture on late night or the 6 o'clock news, but if you go to my website, 6o'clocknews.com, I'll splash that all over there. So I think, again, it is driving them to a specific space because it will get more clicks, it'll get more advertising and things like that.
And I do see a lot of articles, because we do retweet or, put out a lot of things that we see in the news where it does bother me. Victims sometimes will not even be named.
Right.
There'll be a lot about the murderer and then they'll just say the woman or the child. And that kind of gets me because those people, they obviously matter. Here, I think the even larger problem is the stuff that they're sharing kind of feeds into that stereotype already of someone who's trans, that the thing that matters most about Gwen is whatever has to do with her gender or her sex life. It's not, her dreams or her plans for the future or what she cared about.
And I know we've talked about this before in last episode, and this is becoming a broken record with me. We will continue to talk about this. She's 17. Mm-hmm. With the exception of Jaren Neighbors, these guys are in their 20s, and they're giving her alcohol, and they're giving her drugs, and they're having sex with her. She's 17. And
that's something they know, right?
Well, no, I will say that she did lie about her age. But yeah, she said she was 19 instead of 17. So she's under the age of, she's under 21.
Alcohol, yeah.
But what kills me, though, is that in these newspaper articles, for the most part, nobody brings up that fact. They're at a party, they're drinking. And that may be the prude in me, but I'm sorry. If I'm a 25-year-old man giving alcohol to a 19-year-old kid, and I know mathematically the difference between 25 and 19 is not that different, it's still a long. But it was almost and I felt, and again, this is me editorializing again, so I apologize for that. But it did bother me because I felt like the guy's got a pass. This is something everybody, everybody. Well, but it resulted in a girl's death.
It's a good point, though, because I can imagine another victim that same age and the newspaper is choosing to share lurid details about her sex life. There would be a very different reaction from the public. Yeah,
and I to ring that bell that we have rung numerous times this season, and I imagine will continue as long as we do this podcast. One of Sean's favorite terms is that pure victim. She is not what the media considered a pure victim for no reason whatsoever.
Devil's advocate. I have a lot of friends when I was 18 who were 24, and they all fed me alcohol. Are they horrible humans?
No, I'm not saying that, because I will be the first to admit well, second, because you said it. I had the same thing. You know, I had friends that were older than me that did buy me alcohol. I'm not going to name them in case somebody's listening,
Right?
You know, but I joke. But and I'm not saying that stuff doesn't go on. I'm not. But when you're reporting in a newspaper, again, this goes back to my question about context versus details. Yes, it's a detail that they were drinking. Yes, it's a detail that they had taken drugs, and it's a detail that they had sex. That's not the context. That's not the story. And I think when you're splashing this kind of stuff on the news, any kind of news media, that there is a responsibility to go a lot deeper than just give you the bare minimum. And I think, and a lot of articles, I won't say all of them, because a lot, like I said, the two newspapers I marked out, mainly from the East Bay area and the Hayward area, those newspapers did what I think was an excellent job really understanding the story and the nuances of it. And for a local paper, I think sometimes you see that a little more, maybe because it's easier for them to be in the communities because they are from the communities, but that does not excuse the other agencies from not doing the same amount of work.
Some of these aren't so crazy, but let's pause and talk about Rule 1 again. Maintain humanity under 500 million.
Wait, how did I miss that? 500 million? So how would that compare to today's population?
Okay, so that means that about 85% of our population has to go. Y'all, 85%, that's terrifying.
And this thing is supposed to withstand catastrophic events? Is it supposed to predict something's going to happen to the 85%?
I know. I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
What is this? Hi, everyone. This is Brooke from Curly Conspiracies. I hope you liked the clip from our Georgia Guidestones episode. If you want to find out more about this conspiracy, go to curlyconspiracies.com. Or you can find us on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Now, back to what you all came for.
During this time, that while awaiting trial, Jared Neighbors would write a letter to his then girlfriend. In this letter, he confessed to her that he and 3 of his friends, quote, went off on a Tony Soprano-like plan, unquote. That's directly from the letter, to kill Gwen, who the group had known as Lyda. This would be intercepted by the police in mid-November of 2002 and would then lead to Jason Caceres being arrested and charged with first-degree murder with a hate crime addition. Remember, Caceres wasn't initially arrested. He wasn't mentioned at all until Jared Neighbors writes this letter. Caceres was listed as a potential witness as early as October 22nd, but there had been no direct evidence linking him to the crime as far as the police were concerned at that moment. So until Jared Neighbors wrote this letter, Caceres wasn't even on their radar, and none of the other friends had mentioned him at all during their initial interrogations and then subsequent releases for Nicole Brown, Emmanuel Morel, and Paul Morel. In fact, there's not a lot of physical evidence that linked any of the young men to the crime, except for what Neighbors had given them once he was recorded on the wire when he was interviewed, and then again when his later was intercepted. So at this point, there's kind of 3 big interviews for Jared Neighbors that I want you guys kind of remember. Is one, when he was initially talking to his friend, and his friend was wearing the wire. The second time was when they arrest him and initially interrogate him, and he leads them to Gwen's body. And the third time is right after this letter's intercepted, the police yank him out of jail and sit him down and say, okay, explain the letter, and he starts to spill his guts again. Okay. On February 24th, 2003, Neighbors pleads guilty, but to a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. This would carry an 11-year prison sentence. He would get this only if he agreed to testify against his co-conspirators. It was during the formal entry of his plea that Judge Kenneth Burr would warn Neighbors that if he did not live up to his end of the bargain, then he could be charged with murder. During the indictment proceedings, Neighbors would give a detailed account of the murder and disposal of the body. On the stand, he said that, quote, he couldn't believe that someone would ever do that, would be that deceitful, unquote. And that Jose Morel said, quote, he was so mad he could still kick her a couple more times, unquote. So even though he's pleading guilty to the murder, he's still blaming Gwen for being deceitful. His account of the crime is what made up the bulk of the information from our second episode. In exchange for his testimony at trial against the other 3, Neighbors would receive an 11-year sentence on August 25th, 2002. He was given time served and was only expected to serve around 5 more years in jail. The trial would be held in Hayward, California, which is the county seat for Alameda County. Jury selection for the trial began on March 15th, 2004. So this is now 2 years after Neighbors pled guilty to a lesser crime and was given an 11-year sentence. So this would be 2 more years on his sentence. So March 15th, 2004, Superior Court Judge Harry Shepard would preside over the trial. The jurors were asked to fill out a questionnaire. On the questionnaire were questions such as if they knew anyone who was lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Also, if they knew any same-sex couples who had recently married. They were also asked if they'd seen any movie or theatrical performance depicting the activities of a transgender person. There was no specific films or plays mentioned, but they had discussed the play The Laramie Project, which the high school in the area had actually performed shortly after Gwen's death. The Laramie Project, if you're not familiar with it, is about the beating and murder of Matthew Shepard in Laramie, Wyoming in 1998. We talked a little bit about Matthew Shepard in episode 1. They were planning this long before the murder of Gwen happened, and it just happens to be a terrible coincidence. There was also some talk about the movies Boys Don't Cry, and this movie details the rape and murder of Brandon Tina. Also, we talked about him in episode 1 as well. A trans man in Nebraska in 1993. So the questionnaire really is kind of circling around that. They didn't actually specifically, as far as I know, ask if they'd seen the Laramie Project or Boys Don't Cry, but there had been a talk about this in the lead up and some of the interviews. There was some talk about the possibility of having to move the trial to somewhere else early on, but the defense in an interview with the East Bay Times stated that they were confident that they thought that they would be able to find enough jurors to ensure their clients had a fair trial. Quote, "I believe we'll get enough people to set aside their opinions," unquote, said J. Tony Serra, who represents Jason Caceres. He was confident that the trial could remain in Alameda County and remain fair. Eventually, a jury was selected, and the trial would in fact stay in Hayward and the Alameda Courthouse. The jury would be made up of 4 women and 8 men. The first trial, yes, there will be more than one, started on April 14th, 2004. So this is a little less than 2 years after the Gwen's death, and again, 2 years after Neighbors pleads guilty. The prosecutor of this case was Chris Limiero. He would refer to Gwen as Eddie throughout the trial and would continually use the male pronouns when talking about her or asking questions about her. This is another example of dehumanizing Gwen throughout these trials.
So, do you think the prosecutor was actually trying to throw the case, or he just didn't understand what he was doing?
No, I don't. I really think that the prosecutor in this case was unaware of how demeaning and hurtful that would have been had Gwen been alive, but also how hurtful and disrespectful it is to the trans community at large. This is a time, her family, specifically early on, and we'll talk about this as we go along more into this case, but her mom refers to her as her with her dead name early on. I think he's doing his best, and he's coming from a place of ignorance. I don't think it was intentional. I mean, I know he intentionally calls her that name, but I don't believe it was, I'm going to call her by her dead name in order to throw the case or anything like that. Okay. I think it came from a place of ignorance. Now, what I will say, after this first trial, the same prosecutor will use Gwen's legal name, will use the proper name as time goes on. And I think that shows that he's evolved in his opinion and his knowledge a little bit. Magson's defense would open the trial with the argument that Magson should not be charged with murder, but instead manslaughter. He goes on to say that his client, meaning Madsen's defense attorney, says that Michael Madsen was not biased, but rather was shocked, quote unquote, beyond reason, and the fact that he had sex with, quote, a man, unquote, led to this tragedy. This becomes a form of trans panic and a type of victim blaming. So again, we have two instances of dehumanizing of Gwen. We have the first one from the prosecution by dead naming Gwen. I don't think that's intentionally trying to disrespect Gwen. This one by Michael Madsen's defense attorney is definitely disrespectful. It's dehumanizing. And like we said, this is a form of the trans panic defense, which, Jess, you had some information for us.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what you said before I start this section, I do think it must also be the defense is saying this, but also if the prosecutor is dead naming her, has to be constantly reinforced to the jury that that's something that's happening. And coming from someone who's an officer of the court and has a responsibility to the victim, that has to kind of, I don't know, set an example.
I agree with you. I think when you look at this, his unintentional slight to Gwen has larger ramifications, because I think that plays into the defense. You're exactly right. And as a juror listening to that, it's helping you do the mental gymnastics to have a reasonable doubt for the suspects or the murderers in this case.
So the information I'm going to share about the trans panic defense came from two places. The first is the American Bar Association, and the second is the LGBT Bar. We'll have links for both of those on our sites, on our webpage, as Charles said. The trans panic defense is probably something you've heard of, especially if you listen to a lot of true crime. It's connected to the gay panic defense, or the larger idea of the LGBTQ plus panic defense. And I'm going to quote what it says on the LGBT Bar website, because they really explain it very carefully. Quote, "The LGBTQ plus panic defense strategy is a legal strategy that asks a jury to find that a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity or expression is to blame for a defendant's violent reaction, including murder. It is not a freestanding defense to criminal liability, but rather a legal tactic used to bolster other defenses. When a perpetrator uses an LGBTQ plus panic defense, they're claiming that a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity not only explains, but excuses a loss of self-control and the subsequent assault. By fully or partially acquitting the perpetrators of crimes against LGBTQ plus victims, this defense implies that LGBTQ plus lives are worth less than others." There are several famous cases associated with this kind of defense. And it's not just, this is a kind of extreme case, this is murder, but this defense also covers all kinds of crimes. So someone is just assaulted, someone is raped, even things like, maybe you had something stolen from you or taken from you. Most notably, this is associated with, people might know the Jenny Jones case. That's a case where a man went on television. I don't think it was ever aired.
No, the episode, you can find the episode that's been part of a few documentaries, but it was never aired on at least national television.
So a gentleman went on the Jenny Jones show to talk about his crush, which happened to be another man. And eventually, after they go back to living their lives, and that ends with the crush murdering him. It's a terrible case. We'll try and find some, I know there's some podcasts who've done it. We'll definitely link those in our website so that you guys can find it. But they use that defense that he was upset, that his sexuality had been in question, that his gender, the idea of his manhood had been in question, and had to rectify that through violence. It's also the kind of defense strategy that's used in the Matthew Shepard case. And as I said, this isn't just used in a courtroom or in cases of murder, but it's often used as a reason why hate crimes are committed against people who are transgender. In the courtroom, this defense is used in a few different ways. The first is to bolster the claim that a crime was committed when a person was insane or had diminished capacity. We've talked about that defense a couple of times, and the crux of that is to say that the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity is the cause of a mental breakdown or the creation of a panic. So it's not necessarily used as the defense. This is why I did it, but it's used to kind of bolster the idea that you've had a mental breakdown, and here's the reason why. One of the things that's very important to that defense separate from this add-on is that the person committing the crime no longer understands right or wrong and is capable of making rational decisions. So that which we expect in cases where someone says that they've gone insane, they can no longer know what right or wrong is, they no longer see things rationally, that still applies. And again, in this case, we're talking about a murder, but that's, as I said, an extreme. This is used to explain away things like assault, which is a reality that transgender people live in all of the time. Charles, you've talked at length about Gwen and her family and friends feeling scared about like the way she looked, about her leaving the house, who she was hanging out with, and they were really afraid of that kind of just everyday violence happening to her, everyday violence for people who are transgender. And a lot of that is because violence isn't just common between people who know each other, but there are a lot of stories that I read where that violence just occurred. Basically, someone was walking down the street and someone else took issue with the way they were expressing their gender or being who they are and just got out and unfortunately committed assault. So it becomes the mere existence of someone being trans that's the problem, and it's used as an excuse for committing the violence. So I think it's important to know that experience of violence and trying to avoid it isn't just about the situation Gwen was in, but kind of an all-day, everyday thing. The second way this defense is used is to explain a violent reaction to, quote, nonviolent sexual advance. This was used in another case in California of the murder of a 15-year-old named Letitia King. I will try and find a good episode of another podcast about this case because it is really tragic and really horrible. That involved a young trans woman in school flirting and asking another student out, and that was enough to trigger a violent response. So again, that's sort of using this in the same way we were talking about, using this defense to say that the onus is on the victim, not on the person who committed the crime.
And I think one thing I want to bring up too is when we say used as a defense, meaning a lot of these stories that we found, the research that we did, time and time again, the perpetrator was arrested, or detained in some way, and this was used as their defense. And in more cases than not, they were let go or were let out with a lighter sentence for some really terribly violent attacks and assaults on individuals for doing nothing other than just being who they are.
And what's really interesting is in a lot of places, you're not able to use this as an actual defense. And that's true here in California. And it's actually true in this case. It's not used as a reason why they're saying they committed the crime. It's actually used as a way a defense can play on the prejudices of a jury. So this is not an excuse you can use to commit murder. But if you can bring this into the courtroom and affect how people are thinking about the case, then that's where you're hoping to find a chance to change an outcome of what you're doing.
You're almost stacking the deck. You're trying to get the jury to believe the narrative that you're spinning. However, at this time during this trial, this is still a legal strategy that's used and is not illegal to you. So a lawyer would not get in trouble for bringing this up into trial. Right.
But it's not as you're going to tell us, I think, it's not the defense that they actually use. They bring it up, but these gentlemen have pled not guilty. So they're not using this as a reason why they had committed a crime.
Right. They're saying they're using this defense as a way of saying this happened because of her being trans and all of these mitigating circumstances. So that's why they're saying I'm not guilty of murder. Magson says at the very least at the very most I should be guilty of manslaughter.
Right. It's also really interesting because this defense relies on a lot of the stereotypes and just kind of societal beliefs about people who are transgender that have existed for a long time. And one of those is undercutting the idea of being transgender. One of, saying someone is lying, which is kind of what you just explained to us. Believing that you had sex with a man instead of, Gwen is a woman. And so there's a long history of telling people who are transgender that they are lying, that what they're saying isn't real, that they're not who they actually are. And this plays really well into that.
It directly taps into that thing if not only juries, but people reading these stories in the newspaper or listening to them with their own biases and misconceptions, and really with that struggling to understand and put yourself in somebody else's position. Most of us, while I won't say we're 100% always comfortable in our skin, we all struggle with something. Struggling that you were born the wrong gender is something that most of us don't have to deal with.
But it is fascinating to think that this is something that is meant not to be an excuse, but even by any defense now in California, to play on people's prejudices. And not even once people hold, you've probably weeded those people out during jury selection, people who hold very specific views. What you're hoping is to find someone who can kind of understand, just a little inkling inside of what the defense is saying, and then play on that, and you don't realize that it's happening. And this defense goes back a really long way. The gay panic disorder was once in the DSM. It was taken out by the Psychological Association in 1973, and it was actually first used in a Florida murder case in 1954. So it goes back much farther than I had realized before I researched the topic. But it is now illegal here in California to use it, and we'll talk more about that as episodes go on.
And yeah, these series of cases and Gwen's family and supporters directly fighting, along with some other families of victims, have a direct positive impact on how the laws are changed in California. So as terrible as that is, the violence that was done and the lives that were lost and the families that were broken, the small ray of light is that through their hard work and their fighting, that things can be better moving forward. Again, it's not 100%. We're not saying that everything is perfect, but we're saying that through the direct action of a lot of people, we're making progress to be a more inclusive society. So now that we have kind of an understanding of the trans panic defense, we're going to kind of jump back into how these guys are using this to, again, play on the biases of the jurors and kind of spin their narrative that is going to hopefully get them, or in their minds, hopefully get them off with a lesser charge. So Dr. Andrew Pogeman was hired by Michael Madsen's defense to testify on his behalf, but the idea is because of his testimony that hopefully will spill over to the other three. He did not interview any of the defendants, which I thought was crazy. He's a doctor who's was brought in for the defense, but he actually doesn't interview any of the people that he is responsible for testifying for. He is paid at least $2,000. That was reported in a local newspaper, and would instead answer hypothetical questions on the stand from the defense attorneys about what might have happened the night Gwen was murdered. So let that sink in for a second. He didn't interview anyone. He didn't look at any of the evidence. He was asked hypothetical questions by the defense what might have happened. And again, we've talked about it before in this podcast, he's considered an expert witness. His hypothesis was that the men were, quote unquote, sexually deceived. And after having found out Gwen was a trans woman, they would have been driven to an act in an irrational rage and then would be further driven to cover up the murder and lie to each other due to social pressures brought on by their peer group. So he's basically saying that they flipped out, had blinding rage, killed Gwen, and then covered it all up mainly due to peer pressure, mainly for their belief or a fear of other people seeing them as gay. In fact, during this first trial, neighbors will say that his friends had been raped because Gwen had not been what they, again, this is from his words, what they considered truthful about herself. He states, quote, he forced them into homosexual sex, and my definition of rape was being forced into sex, unquote. And I think this kind of goes back to what you said earlier, Sean, about the prosecutor dead naming Gwen, is that their star witness is misgendering Gwen on the stand and again, under cross-examination. So this leads into the defense of the three men on the trial. I do not put Jaron Neighbors into the mix because at this time he'd already taken the plea deal and had pled guilty to the charge of manslaughter. During the trial, the attorney for Michael Madsen, Michael Thurman, would make the claim that Gwen, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, was, quote, deceitfully luring his client into having homosexual sex, unquote. So again, we see this use of this belief that the men were acting out because they were deceived into homosexual sex. He will go on to say, quote, "This is a case that tells a story about deception and betrayal," unquote. He would continue in his opening statement, quote, "Mike Magson does not deny having responsibility for Eddie's death." Again, an example of dead naming. "It happened because of a discovery of what Eddie had done," unquote. He will go on to allege that Magson, in a rage, quote, "beyond reason," again, he says the idea that he's acting in almost like an insanity plea, when he learned that Gwen was a trans woman. Quote, "His," meaning Madson's, "reaction was one of anger and rage and shock and revulsion," unquote. So it goes back into this narrative, this trans panic narrative of these guys were so freaked out that they had no other option except to kill this woman, drive her body 3 hours into the wilderness, bury her, and then drive 3 hours home and stop for McDonald's breakfast and swear to each other to secrecy. By this time, the Guerrero family had retained Gloria Allred to represent them and act as their advocate. And if you're not familiar with Gloria Allred, we have a little bit more information about her and her work.
I think probably most people will be familiar with Gloria Allred. She's a very famous attorney here in California and actually has appeared in cases all across the country. She's very involved often in women's issues, so you'll see her in discrimination or harassment cases. She represented Jane Roe, for instance, in Roe v. Wade. She's done a lot of high-profile cases. She represented Amber Frey in the Scott Peterson case. She represented Nicole Brown Simpson's family. And she's, like I said, she's just done a ton of harassment. You usually see her associated with, I think, feminist causes. I think she represented some of the victims of Weinstein, some victims of rape and sexual assault and harassment in the Marines. She's just known for a lot of high-profile cases. You're going to see her handling the media, so you'll see her on TV a lot. I hear a lot of people kind of complaining about her being on TV or only taking cases to be on TV. But I kind of think, I guess this is just me when it comes to these kinds of cases, you want someone who knows how to do that because people are going to write stories about you either way. You need someone who kind of gets that system. And I think also, I can name Gloria Allred. I can't name a lot of her clients. She takes a lot of the flack for other women who are, speaking out about things. So I think it's kind of an interesting lawyer.
And I think initially, I know my first reaction was seeing her name is, oh yeah, you do see her on the news all the time. And then you, like you said, you really dig into the work that she's done. And she's championing those people who don't often get a voice in the public or the media. And we've seen a lot in some of the cases that we've covered in this podcast that how the media reports on these cases can be directly connected to whether some cases get solved and some cases don't, and some cases get forgotten. And this is somebody who specializes in making sure that the story gets out there and people understand what's going on. And I think, again, in this case, she comes out publicly really, really early on, especially during this first trial, and issues a statement to the press, which denounces the defense as offensive, and really changes this narrative of, oh, these poor guys, they were tricked. They didn't have any choice except to murder a woman. And this Allred comes out publicly and really bashes that idea and just rakes it across the coals. She states, quote, "I think it is really shameful to try to blame the victim, particularly in this case in which the victim is a murder victim. Gwen had every right to be the person she wanted to be, and Magson has no right to kill her," unquote. I think it was really the first time that I saw somebody outside of the family taking a real definitive statement like that. Even the prosecution who's prosecuting this case is not, I didn't think is quite, at least publicly, was not quite as forceful as this in some of the newspaper articles. The trial would continue with more witnesses and accounts of the party and the events that would lead up to Gwen's murder. Dr. Sharon Van Meter, the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy, would testify. She would conclude that the cause of death was asphyxiation associated with blunt force trauma to the head. It was during this part of the trial that jurors were shown graphic photos showing the extent of Gwen's injuries, especially the lacerations to her face and head, as well as the burns from the rope under her chin. At some point during this, Gwen's mother would have to leave the courtroom. And it's another salt in the wounds moment of a woman who's had to listen to her daughter be denigrated and disrespected and dehumanized, and then to be shown these photos of what was done to her daughter while those men are still in the courtroom. It's an instance like this, and in this particular case, that really affected me when I was redoing our research.
It's just another example of parents, really standing up for their kids after their murder, but I can't imagine how hard that was.
During this first trial, Nicole Brown and others will be brought up to testify on behalf of the prosecution. She, along with Emmanuel and Paul Morrell, would testify about what happened at the house in Newark in the early morning hours of October 4th. An article that was written in the East Bay Times by Yomir S. Wrong sums it up pretty well. Quote, "When parties happened at the Morrell house in Newark, the friends all joined in the fun. And when a killing took place, everyone joined in this cover-up." Unquote. Why is it that some of the people that were there, but didn't actually strike Gwen, but also were instrumental in, one could argue, in her assault, and most certainly were in there and involved in the cover-up after the fact, were not facing any charges at all? Gerald Uleman, who is a professor at law at Santa Clara University, who also actually worked on the O.J. Simpson defense, is quoted in an article saying, quote, "The short answer is that you need witnesses." He says the prosecutions will forgo charges against people that might have had something to do with a murder or any crime in order to go after others that you could actually prove had something to do with it. And this one really stuck with me because as reading this, you realize that, yeah, these four men were directly involved with her death, but there were at least 3 other people in that house at the time that this was going on that did nothing, that knew of the cover-up and basically got away with it scot-free. There is hints that there were a lot more people at this party as well. Again, people were brought up as witnesses early on, but there is some thought that there were more people even at the time that Gwen was being assaulted early on. And I understand that you need witnesses, but it just still, it's another instance of, I don't believe everyone got the justice that they should have. I don't know how you guys feel about this.
I brought this up on the other episode, and just after what Nicole Brown had said, she's the one who got in the fight. She's the one that comes out of the bathroom and says, "I can't believe it." I just feel that she's part of it a lot. And to not have her, I don't know, charged with something, like you said, after the fact or something. I mean, she didn't put blows down or anything like that, but she had a lot to do with this, I feel.
Well, and the two brothers, Paul and Emmanuel, all 3 of them drive away, knowing that Gwen was being assaulted in the next room, seeing that Gwen was being assaulted, and then said, "Nah, I'm good, and we're gonna go," because they didn't want to get Paul to get into more trouble because he was on probation.
I'm with Sean on this one, especially because this is a crime of murder, but the crime starts before that crime. And at this time, the felony murder rule exists. So it doesn't matter who hit the fatal blow. And it doesn't even matter if you were part of it. How many cases have we seen of people who are in jail? They never pulled the trigger, but someone they were with did. But because they were involved in the robbery, they go to jail for murder as well. And I know that that's something California has, decided not to pursue anymore, and I think for good reason. But in this case, she's, like Sean said, she's part of the crime of kidnapping Gwen. Gwen tried to leave, and they wouldn't let her. Right. After that point, she had zero ability to control anything. They basically kidnap her. I think they assault her. They sexually assault her. Perhaps they don't rape her, but I definitely think that there's a sexual assault. They're touching her without permission. They're pulling her pants down. They're pushing her into the bathroom. And Nicole is a part of all of that. So even if you say she's not, responsible for her murder, which I do kind of find ridiculous, and I don't understand why this case is different from the millions of others, perhaps because people are paying attention, or perhaps because they could afford lawyers. I don't know. But I think other people would have ended up in jail with the same exact murder one rap.
And I'm with you guys. I believe the argument that, well, we need witnesses and we'll get them if we don't prosecute.
Well, and that's frustrating too.
Exactly.
There are other people at this party and they never come forward to testify.
Right. And going through, especially the East Bay Times articles, it's a known party house. I cannot imagine that for whatever reason this night alone, and it is written in a few different sources, that there are more people at this party.
The thing is that you were saying witnesses testifying or not even coming up to testify. It was Gwen's aunt and then the guy from Monday Night Football that were the ones that called. None of these people even called it in.
Right.
So it's like, it's not even just testifying. No one even spoke up.
How much a difference they could have had, holding all of these people accountable, the things that they saw.
How much a difference could they have made in Gwen's life had they stopped it? Had they, and I know there's been tons and tons of research done on people speaking out when they see something wrong happening. But I also know that the same studies are proving that if one person says something, it's more likely than two people. And if two people say something, it's more likely than you'll get three people. And if there were that many people at this party, it really kills me that more people wouldn't have said something. Now, after Nicole Brown's testimony, there are many in the courtroom that believed, as we do, that Nicole and the others should be charged with their involvement in the case. Nicole actually would be asked why she didn't notify the police right away, or even at a later date, or the next, or any of the days in between the killing and October 17th, when the men were finally arrested. She said that she didn't report the crime and did indeed withhold information because, if you remember correctly, Nicole was actually interviewed early on, and she's like, I don't know anything. So now it's coming back to, they question her about this in court. Why didn't you say anything? And she says she didn't report the crime. And again, like I said, she intentionally withheld information from police when initially interviewed out of fear of reprisals or a criminal prosecution. So she's saying, I'm withholding information because I'm afraid that I will either be prosecuted for this crime or reprisal from one of the guys. She was afraid that, and I'm not trying to downplay that fear. It's possible that she was afraid for her life. J. Tony Serra, who was Jason Caceres' defense attorney, would grill Nicole Brown on cross-examination. He would focus on the reliability of her testimony. Brown admitted to having smoked marijuana and drinking at least a dozen beers on the night of the attack. He would continue and get Brown to admit that she had never seen Caceres to strike Gwen at all. He would continue to press her about the fact that neighbors had tried to get her to lie for them to the police. So he's really had this full court press about making Caceres seem like he's not even involved at all. It seemed that neighbors had wanted her to state that any blood at the house that the police had found there was because of an earlier fight that Gwen had with her a few weeks before that we had talked about between her and Nicole. She would state, quote, I told the police the truth. I didn't go with his lie, unquote. The defense would continue on this track of tearing down the prosecutor's star witnesses and going back to the idea that Gwen was to blame because she was, quote unquote, deceiving the men about herself, and their actions were those that were born out of rage and were not premeditated or thought out. Thorman would defend his position for the press outside the courtroom. Quote, I don't think I'm blaming the victim at all. Eddie Araujo's behavior was obviously a provocation, but I don't blame him in the sense that I see that Eddie was a confused and troubled person who needed help. It's horrible that these things happen, but it's just a reality. It's not a matter of blaming. It's all how this ended up happening the way it happened, unquote. Which is a horrible quote to say publicly about a murder victim when you're the person defending the murderer. Christopher Daly, who is the co-founder of San Francisco-based Transgender Law Center, that was started around this time, would state for the Associated Press, quote, whether or not Gwen made some bad choices that night, that should not be part of us as a society deciding how to respond to the behavior of the defendants, unquote. And I think this goes back again, and we've said this a lot in these series of episodes, but I think that this has been kind of an overall theme, not only for this season, but a lot of the cases that we covered in our first season. It's just a question of a pure victim and how Gwen is portrayed differently than some other women that we've talked about.
Well, I think going over what you keep saying, I could be wrong in thinking this, but as you keep saying that they were duped, it was deceitful and everything like that. When a man or woman tells someone they're not married and then they find out after they're married, they don't murder that person. I mean, I'm going through all the deceitful things in my head when it's coming up.
Right. I think the defense using the terms like deceiving and deceitful and lying, and again, it goes into that trans panic narrative of Gwen was a liar, and, if she hadn't lied, she'd be alive. It was her fault. It was her fault. It was her fault. Again, victim blaming.
Right. And I think you're right on topic with like the whole pure victim thing, because if you think about how we have talked about it in other cases, they had it coming, like the hitchhiker at 3 a.m.
Right.
kind of thing. And they're trying to say that Gwen had it coming, and it's horrible.
And that last quote, not the last quote from Christopher Daly, but the quote from Thorman, the defense attorney, it happens. It's just a fact of life. That's not an excuse. It shouldn't be. Somebody was violently killed for who they were. That shouldn't be looked at with some cavalier attitude. Well, that's just the way life is. We just have to get used to it.
Well, and I think aside from whichever side someone might fall on other events or what happened that night, the question is, did these gentlemen have the ability to walk away?
Right.
To not proceed with what they chose to do. And I keep coming to the conclusion that yes, like you're both saying, they did have that choice. And it's interesting that the defense would use this when they haven't even brought forth, in a real trial, not a real trial, in a trial where someone is saying, I'm insane, you would have to prove that.
Right.
But here they don't. They weren't even interviewed by somebody who has the ability to talk about that on their behalf or talk about what their state of mind is. And so it's even more galling that he would continue to say this.
And it will get more confusing as we go on, because we're getting to a point where when we get to the next trial, that the stories all change. And I think that was a hard one, because you take this track of this is my defense, and oh wait, we're changing everything. It's not, and they start pointing the fingers at each other, and it degenerates and kind of into chaos. But I love what you said about the idea of at any moment these men had a chance to walk away. All they had to do was let her leave. All they had to do was let her walk out that door, and we wouldn't be talking about here. Gwen possibly would still be alive. The Araujo family wouldn't have lost their daughter. Some of these men wouldn't be in prison, possibly. But they didn't. They made a choice. They had a choice, and they chose wrong. Like you said, regardless of what you believe about social issues or any of that other kind of stuff, they did not have the right to take a woman's life.
Like Sean said, the only difference here really is the victim. In any other circumstance, we wouldn't be even having this conversation.
No, we wouldn't. Christopher Daly will also say about the legal system in California in general, quote, I think especially because of the way the defense team handled this case, that one of the overarching themes is going to be, are transgender people valued in our society? Like it or not, this verdict is going to be some measure of that, unquote. And I think that's true of a lot of cases when you see violence against a marginalized population of people, whether it's violence against African Americans, violence against Asian Americans, any minority cases, and women as well. That question is, does the legal system see that person as an equal to anybody else? And unfortunately, and a lot of times, I agree, it doesn't.
Right.
And that's a problem that needs to be addressed. This first trial would continue with this defense going on the attack on the prosecutor's star witness of Jaron Neighbors. J. Tony Sierra would call Jaron, quote, a cold, calculating, selfish person who had lied on the witness stand to get a sweetheart deal for himself, unquote. In fact, Sarah would go so far as to blame Neighbors as the primary aggressor for the attack, who had tried to deflect the blame onto the other three men. He will shout at Neighbors in the middle of the courtroom while he's on the witness stand, quote, you're up to your neck in this. You're holding back, aren't you? You're guilty as hell and you're lying, unquote. Sierra will go after Neighbors, asking him why he did not mention Caceres to the police from the start, if Jason Caceres had something to do with it. It was only after Jaron Neighbors' letter was intercepted by the police while he was in prison that they arrested him. Sarah maintains that Neighbors did this to implicate his client, Caceres, and in order to get the police to cut him a deal. Quote, "You substituted my client for yourself, didn't you? What you say my client did, you did. Isn't that true?" Unquote. Neighbors will admit that he did lie in the past, but all of his testimony was truthful in court. He would say that spending 11 years, the sentence that was given to him for his testimony was not a sweetheart deal. He would have to serve 9 years of it before he was eligible for parole. Now, both sides would wrap up their arguments and closing statements on June 13th. It would now be up to the jurors to decide the fate of these 3 men. After 9 days, they came back with not having reached a unanimous decision. The judge would ask them if they believed that more time would help them reach a conclusion. The jury stated that they did not believe that more time would get them any further into actually coming with a unanimous decision, and this trial was concluded in a mistrial. The final vote was 10-2 in favor of acquitting Morell and Caceres for first-degree murder, and 7-5 in favor of convicting Magson for first-degree murder. It's no wonder that this verdict would send shockwaves throughout the community of not just the Bay Area, but ripples throughout California and, in fact, the United States. And this is where we're going to leave it off for this episode of California True Crime. Next time, we'll get into the specifics of the verdict and why the jurors voted the way they did. And this is where we're going to leave it for this episode of California True Crime. Next time, we'll get into the specifics of the verdict and why the jurors voted the way they did. We'll also talk about the next legal proceedings and how it was then that the story really changed. Jessica will be taking us through a cold case for this episode.
On November 23rd, 1990, the body of an unidentified female was found down an embankment off the side of Sunrise Highway near mile marker 33.5 in Mount Laguna in San Diego, California. She was found to be a trans woman by the name of Laura, whose name was Felix Patricio Abarca at birth. Her body was so decomposed that it made identification difficult. 2 things were evident, though. First, her hands were bound behind her back with yellow cord. Second, the cause of death was asphyxiation. The last time anyone had seen Laura, it was on October 17th. She would not be reported missing until November 18th. Her body would not be found until 5 days after that. Early in the investigation, sheriff's deputies would think that Laura's murder was another in the string of 44 killings that had taken place in the area. That stretched back to 1985. These murders were being attributed to a serial killer that had dumped their victims in the area near where Laura would be found. This claim would later be disproved by cold case detectives that were looking into the case. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Sheriff's Homicide Detail at 858-285-6330 during business hours, or the Sheriff's Communications Center at 858-565-5200 outside business hours. You can also call Crime Stoppers at 888-580-8477.
If you or somebody you love is dealing with issues related to being trans, there are people who can help. Contact the National Center for Transgender Equality. They have a wealth of resources and a number of people who can help with all sorts of issues, including healthcare, insurance, legal issues, immigration, international resources, and even Veterans Affairs. We'll be posting these links and more on our website, californiatruecrime.com. Take the time to reach out and help end the hate and bigotry.
Thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime. For a full list of our sources, as well as more information on the case, head over to our webpage at californiatruecrime.com. You can also support the show by finding a link to our Patreon on this page, which has the options of ad-free episodes. If you'd like to contact us, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Cali True Crime. If you enjoy the episode, please leave us a review. We'd like to thank our quality control engineer, Melanie Duncan. This was recorded at the Hangar and Snail Ranch Studios. This is a production of Way Grimace.